Hello, my name is Chanel Trail, and I talk about the deeper aspects and esoteric aspects of ourselves and reality. Today, I want to talk about the full solar eclipse that's going to happen on February 17th, and it's going to pass through Antarctica. First of all, I wanted to talk about eclipses in general and how to interpret eclipses because I don't know if it's talked about deeply by astrologers or if it's clarified by some astrologers because I get the impression that eclipses are sometimes seen as the same, that all eclipses affect different areas the same, and that is not true. So I'm going to clarify some misconceptions, although there is a little bit of differentiation between the way different astrologers interpret, and I'm going to point that out too. So traditional astrologers and traditionally eclipses only affected the area that the eclipse was passing over, and it would affect individual people across the planet where the eclipse was touching. For example, if the eclipse is in Aquarius and you have multiple planets in Aquarius, then that eclipse is going to be very personal and you're going to feel that eclipse a lot. Many modern astrologers tend to lean towards the eclipse affecting all around the world, although most of them don't agree that it's affecting around the world equally. Astrology evolves as human consciousness evolves, and I think to some extent the ancient interpretation has evolved to some extent because we are living in a more global world and we're more conscious of what's happening in other parts of the world. And say if eclipse happens over a country, exactly over a country, and that country is connected to another country, then there can be ripple effects. And so the way that I think about it is that it primarily affects the area where the eclipse is going directly over, and then it's going to affect other areas indirectly. And it's also, like I said before, going to affect people where the eclipse is very personal in their chart. And so I see it as this ripple effect, that it's going to affect areas near the area less and less and less. And then also it's going to affect any area that is connected to it. And to some extent, we're a very globalized world. So it's going to have a ripple effect in different areas that it's connecting to. But some areas aren't going to have that much effect at all. The last reason why an eclipse can affect an area possibly outside of the actual eclipse path is astrocartography and geodetic lines, which I haven't looked deeply into that, and some astrologers don't necessarily agree with that, but some do, and so I wanted to mention that. And the reason why I'm mentioning all of this, how to read eclipse in general, is because this eclipse is going to be over Antarctica, so we have to take that into account, that it's not going over any large populations. Eclipses in general act as forces of change and kind of like a lightning strike that may be more subtle and internal and maybe not always externally obvious, or it could be externally obvious depending on the other circumstances. They tend to trigger what is already happening underneath, which in this case is the Saturn-Neptune conjunction at 0 degrees Aries with the harmonic triangle. So it's just going to act like a trigger or an agent of change for that specific configuration that is going on. Also, the effect of eclipses don't tend to last very long. They can last weeks, months, and they definitely don't last longer than 6 months because then a new eclipse cycle starts to take effect. Because this full solar eclipse is going over Antarctica and it's a pole and there's not any large population, how I interpret it is it's going to be more behind the scenes shift. It's going to be more foundational, more subtle, but it's going to support the change that's happening with the current configuration. And also another aspect about Antarctica, although there's not a population there, it is a place that is a contract of many different countries. Many different countries have a contract around Antarctica. So there may be a shift in the power structures of the way these different countries interact with each other. That is a possibility that can come from this. This full solar eclipse is in Aquarius, at the end of Aquarius, and it's squaring Uranus, and it's in the same sign as where Pluto is right now, and it's happening at the same time, although there's not an aspect to the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. It's happening at the same time. Even though this eclipse is going to be subtle because it's in Antarctica and it's not hitting any population, so it's more kind of this hitting this possibly the collective unconscious and rippling from there, it is going to be transformational because of that square to Uranus. And also, Uranus, as I mentioned before, is currently on algal. So there's that extra kind of unconscious rage or the shadow of humanity that is going to get rumbled. There's going to be some earth shaking kind of rumbling underneath. And that is going to be directly connected to this eclipse and possibly be the source of what triggers whatever is going to happen with this eclipse in the future. I think of it visually as you can think of lava or magma rumbling under the earth. And you might not see these external shifts, but there's some lava that's rumbling around, and then maybe the next transit or something may trigger something. On an individual level, this eclipse, especially if this eclipse is close to personal planets, sun, moon, etc. for you, or if it's close by also Uranus, then it might shake up some internal shadows within yourself or something that you're repressing in yourself, and you're going to be forced to face that at some point. Maybe not right away, but during this eclipse season, that will come up. So I would say this eclipse and then also the conjunction with Saturn, Neptune, and that configuration will have a particular effect on you if you have planets in the early degrees of the cardinal signs, which includes Aries, Libra, Capricorn, and Cancer, or the end of Taurus, or the beginning of Aquarius, or the end of Aquarius, or probably Aquarius in general, then you're going to have these shifts, you're going to feel these shifts much stronger. Because of this emphasis in Aquarius for the eclipse, and then also Pluto entered there relatively recently, there's going to be this emphasis of transformation of collective systems, technology, ideological and cultural shifts towards technology, and shifts and transformation in our social structures. Something that society is suppressing will be made apparent, especially with that Uranus on algal squaring this eclipse. Something is rumbling and will be made apparent at some point. And it's going to be something that the population doesn't want to see. And honestly, we can kind of already see this happening with the Epstein files, but I think this is going to continue. This trend is going to continue, and this eclipse is basically showing that. So to most of the human population, the shadow will be disturbing to them. And so that will ignite some potential change. This Uranus on algal being connected to this eclipse kind of reminds me of a pimple popping and a detoxing effect. And it's kind of shocking and unexpected for some people. And it's one of those things that, you know, there have been people that have been talking about the shadow government and have been aware of it for a long time, but most people, they don't want to see it. They don't want to look at it. They don't want to know. And now this eclipse is, I think, the beginning, and I think to some extent it's kind of started before, the beginning of people are being forced to look at the darker sides of reality, and it's kind of like a pimple popping to the surface. So instead of being under the surface, now we're able to see it. And seeing it more on a collective level and not just certain individuals that have researched these type of topics really deeply. I've mentioned before in some of my first videos when I was talking about this configuration and what it might cause, and one thing I did say was that the shadow government will be revealed to some extent. And what's funny is that later I saw an astrologer that was doing some research on past Neptune-Saturn conjunctions, and they found that there's a connection between Saturn-Neptune conjunctions and the revealing of some type of secret groups, or sometimes even the initiation of certain secret groups and secret societies. There's this connection between Saturn-Neptune conjunction and secret societies. So I thought that was interesting that I saw that later after I did that prediction. And so I think that, you know, what I was seeing after observing the configuration is definitely a trend that also happens historically. Solar eclipses signify a birth, something new and seeding. And because this is in Aquarius, we're ceding more power to the people. I think this is kind of the beginning of that, like I said, the beginning, and moving away from concentration of power, which Leo represents more concentration of power. Even Leo represents more open concentration of power, like monarchy, but I think we can apply it to the concentration of power, even though it's been more hidden in the modern case. So I mentioned before that the first seeding of these events, I think, started on the new moon in Mula in the galactic center on December 19th. There was that not eclipse, new moon was sandwiched between Venus and Mars, and I talked about how it signifies this balancing of the masculine and feminine that will arrive. So what's interesting is you also have the same sandwiching of Mars and Venus, but I would say Mars is a little bit more separated and barely conjunct, whereas Venus is much more conjunct with this eclipse, which I think signifies more emphasis on the divine feminine with this eclipse coming through. I also think that Venus being here is going to, and Venus is actually in Pisces, it's right across, because the eclipse is technically at the very end of Aquarius at 28 degrees, I believe, and Venus is conjunct, but it's right across in Pisces, and Venus really enjoys Pisces, it's exalted there, so there's going to be this value changes because Venus has a lot to do with our values and what we value. Venus also being at the center of this eclipse also indicates that our financial systems, because on a mundane level, Venus can be indicative of the financial or the money systems, can also shift. And my sense, because Venus is exalted in Pisces, that it will shift in a way that will relieve the burden of people in some way. If it shifts in a financial way, which I talked about in the previous video in the configuration, that I think that's very likely to happen within this year or very soon, within this next year or so. Although I'm not sure how profound this change is going to be, it might not. I think it's very possible that we might stay in this kind of heavy feeling economy, even though there might be some change. At the same time, we could stay in this heavy level economy because there are also these greater cycles, astrological cycles, that are connected to recession, and we're not really quite out of this down. So although I think there could be change that could give some relief towards people, at the same time, I don't think we're going to be completely out of it or anything like that. There might be some cultural and aesthetic changes, and there might be this kind of blending of technological, cultural, and spiritual ideals in culture in some way because of this combination of the eclipse being in Aquarius and then there's Venus in Pisces. So I think there might be some combination of this potentially arise in our culture, or at least start to arise in our culture. And I think additionally with Venus in Pisces, this also can indicate the seeding of some spiritual type of movement, or also the seeding of the way we see relationships. There also might be an increase of earthquakes because of Uranus in Algol in Taurus and Earth sign. So there might be an increase of earthquakes or even volcanoes, some type of rumbling under the earth in some way, in addition to flooding and tsunamis because of that connection with Saturn-Neptune conjunction and connected with Uranus, or tsunamis is kind of a combination of flooding and earthquakes. So that is a possibility. Any of those are a possibility. In conclusion, I do think that this will be subtle and, like I said, foundational, maybe have more long-term effects, and it won't be so striking or obvious this particular eclipse. It is going to pretty much just ignite what is going on already with the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, because it's happening right at the same time, exactly the same time, and it's going to ignite also what's going on with the harmonic triangle connected to that conjunction in general. On a personal level, in conclusion, this will create a lot of transformation, a lot of looking at a lot of your shadow appearing and you being forced to look at it, even when you didn't want to look at it or you didn't even know it was there. This might be something that might happen to this time, or just transformation in general, a lot of growth in some way, or the rumbling up of your life. If you want to know more about how this configuration is affecting you on a personal level, or this eclipse, or anything else that might happen within this year, or in general, if you want to know about your chart, or if you want to know more about your fixed stars, then you can look at my website that is in the description, and also it is on the YouTube channel. So I offer astrological readings, and I also have some other services like hypnotherapy also. So you can check that out if you're interested. I talk about many different esoteric topics and the deeper aspects and patterns of reality. Lately, I've been talking about mundane astrology because what's happening this year is pretty unique, so I really want to talk about it. But if you're interested in any esoteric topics, I cover that. Or if you're interested in the content so far, then subscribe to this channel. And thank you for listening, and talk to you later.